Anyway, you were talking about something else.
Yeah, I'll talk about whether or not the Federal Reserve was private. So,
right.
Now, I do want to say, so because I grew up, in quotes, with Peace Revolution podcast, there's a lot of G. Edward Griffin, the Creature from Jekyll Island material within those podcasts. So I grew up thinking, in quotes, philosophically, we'll say it that way, economically, thinking that the Federal Reserve was a private institution. But after, what's the word I want? Interacting with Nima, coming into contact with Nima, and I learned
after enlightenment.
After enlightenment from Nima, unquestionable enlightenment from Nima. Here's a really good question, and I posed it to the guy at the Grand Theft World Town Hall, which is, what's the evidence that it's private? Where is it? And his response was, well, I can't tell you because the people who own it are secret. And I'm like, well, I can tell you the people who own it, and it's not secret at all. Actually, not own it, but who the members are. That's what I meant to say. Excuse me.
That's a very strange argument to make. I can't tell you because it's secret. Well,
if we
how do you know it then? How do you know that it's private if it's all a secret that we can't know? I don't understand it.
Well, I mean, I guess if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, it talks about members, and then you can say, okay, there's members here, and typically members have to do with ownership. In typical is the important word there, corporate language, right? But if you continue reading the Federal Reserve Act, it tells you who the members are. It's every fucking bank in the country. In order to be a bank in the United States, you have to be a member of the Federal Reserve, and that membership doesn't give you any ownership over it. It's all intricate legal stuff wrapped in corporate language, right? And I was really confused because I brought this up, and you brought this up to me, Nima, is what does the Federal Reserve do with 98% of its profits?
Returns them to the Treasury.
Returns it to the Federal Treasury. Something that a private institution owned by secret members would totally do. They would totally do that. And and the remaining 2% does go out to the members. So basically, as a bank in the United States, you must become a member of the Federal Reserve, and you get a subsidy for doing that. Every year or quarter or whenever they send that money out. So 2% of the profit that the Federal Reserve gets split up between all the member banks, which is all the banks in the United States. Right? And Tony kept talking about the tax status of the Federal Reserve, and I was unfamiliar what he was talking about. But if it's property taxes, then I again, show me the evidence that the Federal Reserve pays property taxes, because I wasn't able to find it.
Right.
You
seems
can't
like they
pull up the property records.
Yeah. It seems like that was, if I remember correctly, you had determined that they don't pay property taxes.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I did, and honestly, this is cursory, but I still think it's a pretty important point, is who property taxes and who pays them is public record everywhere, right? If I go to Nima's house, I can look up the property taxes, how much they are, and then I can do a public records request and say who paid the property taxes last time, and they have to send it to me, right? So I went and looked up the address for the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C., because there's a Washington, D.C. parcel search website. You can go look up property taxes and stuff in Washington, D.C., and when you type in the Federal Reserve address, nothing comes up.
It would be interesting to look at also the New York Fed and the Minneapolis Fed.
I did.
Yeah.
I didn't look at all of them, but I did go. I think I looked for one in Washington. I found another one in like the middle of the country or somewhere. All of them, nothing.
Okay. Well, and I think these are all very nice and esoteric discussions.
But at the end of the day, what's the actual function, right?
Right. What's the point of this whole? Is it public or private? It's a big topic. For everyone has their own little issues, but for a lot of the Austrians, it's the Fed. They're increasing the money supply, and that's bad. And that's
and they're not. They don't. They don't. Well, let me say it this way: they don't increase the money supply if you understand the money supply from a what's a good term I want
for all practical purposes.
from a practical standpoint, they do not. Because
And
if you say reserves are money and treasury bonds are not, yes, they increase the money supply. When you recognize that they're both money and they're just moving these numbers back and forth, then they're just moving numbers back and forth between savings and checking accounts. Yeah. You look like you're thinking something.
Well, I was just trying to think. So the main points, which is on the one hand, what you brought up, the entire profit is basically sent to the treasury.
I think that's the biggest point. That's the biggest
which private corporation does it? Well, nobody does it. And also the board of governors, the majority of the people in the board of governors are elected by politicians. They're elected, I believe, by the Senate. Or appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate or something like that. I mean, a very large chunk. There's also a portion that gets elected by the Federal Reserve banks themselves, who in turn, of course, like are owned by these private banks. So they get a say in what happens, but they're not the only ones who get a say in it. There's politics involved as well. There's a president appointing, this Senate confirming. And these people, they make pretty important decisions. They make actually the biggest thing that the news media, everyone always looks at is interest rates. And yes, they do set the short-term interest rates, and that has an impact on people's valuation of assets. So from that standpoint, that's practical. I can use that, and it helps me make better decisions, make predictions about the financial aspects of the economy and financial assets and how they're affected by that. Also, what's not discussed so much, where they also they exercise powers with setting lending standards. And
that's interesting. Talk more about that.
Well, the Federal Reserve is supposed to monitor the individual banks, and the banks get dissolved if they don't manage.
I didn't realize it was the Federal Reserve that had the authority, that was in charge of doing that.
They do. So, I think so. They have a say in the lending standards of the individual member banks.
Okay.
That can. Of course, there's probably also legislation. Obviously there was at one point this Community Reinvestment Act that was passed by Congress, and then that was also binding on the banks somehow. But certainly the Federal Reserve has some say in regards to.
Well, and then to the point, whoever does it, it's someone from the government has the ability to dissolve a bank if they're not following the rules.
Right.
I think that I don't think people understand the gravity of that, and why when we say the private sector banking system is kind of sort of not really private. Even though, you know, we would, Nima and I could start a bank in the similar way that we would go start any other business, but we become so much government at that point because the government comes in and says, okay, you got to make this many loans on auto, this many loans on homes, this many loans on percentage of loans on this many loans percentage on that, and if you get out of whack and you don't loan to a certain number of minorities or whatever, we shut you down. And basically, the government is extending the license of being able to create money to these, in quotes, private banks, but the number of regulations that they have to follow, just in terms of who they're allowed to extend that money to, is very, very strict.
Right. I mean, they're giving people the privilege of being a member of this banking
money production
system.
Class. Yeah.
Money. You can exchange reserves at par. So your accounts, your deposits are guaranteed by the taxpayer, by the public sector. So it's a public-private partnership on the individual bank level. We call it private banks. It's a public-private partnership, right? The deposits are publicly insured. The loans, the banks is responsible for privately. But the extent to which they can't cover deposits, there's insurance, there's FDIC coming in, et cetera, et cetera. So a very different animal from your average manufacturing company or whatever. A bank is a corporation, is a company, certainly, but it's tied in with a very, complex regulatory bureaucratic system, and you become part of the government to some extent when you're a bank. You're never really completely independent.
Well, when I was
by the way, the CIA, for example, they set up private banks and then just make loans to fund CIA operations. So the CIA.
That's a good idea. Shit, Nima.
Well, right. I mean,
let's go start a bank.
That's what they did with BCIS. I think. Forgot the name of the bank. BCCI, the scandal. It was like, I think, the 80s, late 70s, 80s, CIA drug running, etc. BCCI, I think, forgot what it stands for, but yeah, they were pretty big involved there. And
so if we start our own bank, we can lend to our own.
Well, if you start your own bank and you are with the CIA and you go to the bank regulator and say, hey, we're with the CIA, we're going to do whatever because we're working on some operation that you don't want to interfere with, who knows what they can do?
Yeah,
who knows how much they can get away with? But yes, what they've done is they've made loans to CIA fund operations. Right now, you don't need Congress money. Now you don't need approval in the Senate or whatever. You make loans, and then the bank was dissolved and went bankrupt, and the taxpayer would basically pay out on the deposits that they were on the hook for through the FDIC. Yeah, that's absolutely something they've done, and something that's, the Austrians who care so much about the banks being corrupt and creating money out of nowhere, I've never really heard them much talk about this kind of angle.
There's a lot of angles we haven't heard them talk about. I wanted to say one more thing about the Federal Reserve being private or not, which is the fact that it's created by an act of Congress.
All right.
And what it is defined by the language within that act. How many other private businesses do you know were created by an act of Congress?
Yeah, but the banks they have shares in it, so it's all.
Oh
private.
yeah, that's right. They have membership in it, and that's the end of it. Okay. If everybody who's watching this now or recording could like, share, and subscribe it helps us out a lot.
Yeah.
I hate saying it, but it's just true.